Hello and welcome to another episode of Truthiverse. I am your host, Brendan D. Murphy, and we are on Healthy Life Radio. This week, I am joined by the epic Allison McDowell, who is an independent mom, investigator, blogger at wrenchingthegears.com, and a very, very articulate proponent of, I would say, humanity at this point in time. So with that said, Allison, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me.
Yeah, well, thank you for extending the invitation. And I'm based here in Philadelphia in the U.S.
So you are in Philadelphia, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's start with, firstly, I'd love to know, because you are so articulate with what I've heard you talk about and the detail and your big picture understanding of the sort of global machinery of what's going on and what's driving the globalization, but also the pandemic narrative and what's behind that at an economic level and, the behind the scenes kind of stuff. How did you end up first getting into this world and starting your study?
I've been doing activism around the privatizing of public schools in Philadelphia, which were a large city, a poor city, in a crucible for that. So that's sort of how I got my feet wet and my eyes open to the way in which the world is intentionally broken and how the profit factors are built into that. And, especially when you come into something where the target of the brokenness is children, in that system and the future of society, and that it's how we're educating kids. That's how I came into it initially. And then looking at the technology that was used in the schools and the layering in, not just of the profit center around the technology, but also the surveillance and the data mining of children through that. And then eventually it sort of segued into that treatment of humanity as a data commodity, as a profit center, wasn't limited to schools. It was really every facet of society and increasingly built into the public benefit systems. So the poor who needed to access benefits under the guise of accountability and transparency were being data mined and put into service pathways that would never actually get them out of poverty, but just maintain them in sort of well-managed, impoverished circumstances. And we're a city of great poverty. And the politicians and the think tanks and the academics were all about, well, we're going to call Philadelphia, we're going to make it a model impact economy. And that's what they call it, a social impact economy. We're going to be the Silicon Valley of impact investing, which means that like all of the rich people on the main line are going to data mine the poor people in the city. And this led into COVID. And then clearly the mass global economic implosion is catalyzing these large potential markets in poverty management.
Thank you. And I wanted to start with this, and you've kind of segued into it nicely, which is this scamdemic. Like you said, this is a global phenomenon. I mean, we've had the global sort of lockdown. Most countries have shut themselves down, imploded economically, and it's clearly a top-down structure, power structure that's initiated this. So why have those at the top of the pyramid, and we'll talk about who and what and stuff, but why are they deliberately crashing economies and engineering poverty when, obviously even most people in the political system would not want this to happen? It just happens to, as far as I can see, most people, certainly in Australian politics, are just useful idiots, and they don't know any better, right? So they're just kind of like...
You'd think by now they'd start to look.
You'd think so, right? I mean,
yeah.
How much more until they do start to look? But so why do we want to put people... I mean, the middle class is basically decimated and destroyed at this point in time. There's not much left of it. As you're saying, it's not accidental, it's deliberate. So why do we want to put everyone into a state where they're, dependent on welfare and these government handouts and stuff? Who's doing this? Why?
Well, I think it's like within certain circles, pretty widely understood that we look to Davos and the World Economic Forum as sort of the source of what's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And so it's this major transformation, and the elements of this Fourth Industrial Revolution include the movement to automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, synthetic biology, all of these things that will foundationally transform the world. And this piggybacks on the work that's been happening over several decades towards the Agenda 21, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is sort of steeped in this technocratic approach to systems management, like human computing systems management of not just humanity, but the earth. So there's two pieces that are being engineered. And that was advancing over the past 2 decades with advances in technological systems. And I feel at this point, we're at this pivot. Davos has clearly laid out these plans. Klaus Schwab has his book about the Great Reset. There's 5 elements, if you look at the World Economic Forum, that I think really clearly lay out what the program is. And that, it's the Fourth Industrial Revolution. That is the plan. In 2019, they have an annual gathering in Davos in January. In 2019, it was called Globalization 4.0. So they are envisioning the next wave of globalization, which is beyond simply, globalized supply chains and platform labor, that we're really going to seriously start to platform and automate whole sectors of the middle class and white collar jobs and other things. So that's coming in tandem with virtual reality and augmented reality systems, where literally you could be in a haptic suit like in the next decade and operate a factory in another continent at the cheapest labor. So, it's really changing the nature of globalization. That was set last year. And then in 2020, they advanced stakeholder capitalism. So that's what happened, the 6 weeks before COVID was announced, is that they're saying capitalism is over, the old fashioned kind, and now stakeholder capitalism, which is poverty management capitalism under the guise of progressive sort of paternalistic care with Internet of Things automation, that's going to be the new plan around the world. But for the technocracy to work, they need these systems of cloud computing and also the Internet of Things with the 5G system, soon to be 6G and blockchain decentralized ledgers that will track all of this data and feed into the AI system, so that essentially your humanity is living in sort of a cyber physical world that is like a virtualized world that is learning you as you live in these smart environments. And Philadelphia is a smart city. So I sort of have a macro micro, but that's World Economic Forum has whole papers called the Internet of Bodies. So they've an Internet of Actions, where actually like systems become almost like self-actualizing through AI and digital twins. So these are all things that are happening, but they are happening to serve the needs of transnational global capital, right? It's not any one country. So they needed something that would actually consistently within a short time frame lock everyone into this new system and establish a structure to impose that. And my feeling is strongly that what they need to do this is these digital identity systems, which if it was a voluntary system like Aadhaar in India was an early phase with Gates backing this digital identity, but it was optional. Like a lot of people got it, but you didn't have to. But if you frame it as a national security threat, right? If you create an illness or you create a sense of urgency that we are under continual attack, like a bioterror attack, and that if you do not fulfill your obligation to be tracked in this Internet of Things world, that you are a threat to society, that's how they're going to get everyone into the system. I think that will probably roll out in the next, they talk about a 5-year time frame, and so these series of injections and the injection recordings will facilitate that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the World Bank on one of their websites, they have this something along the lines of a pandemic response plan. And we're in it now. They're running this pandemic response thing right now. And it was scheduled. And this, I think, is very interesting with what you're saying. You mentioned, running this for another 5 years or so. Their response is scheduled to only finish in 2025. It seems like they want to continue this state of shutdown, lockdown, paralysis, and feeding us into this AI sort of data management system where they're harvesting our biometrics. I mean, there's this clear obsession with tagging us, harvesting our data, and genetically profiling everyone. As you're saying, like that's where all this seems to be going. So it seems like...
I will say the stakeholder capitalism piece, and I think something that is not as commonly discussed as I think merits, is that actually there are financial products, right? Like we've seen anyone who was paying attention to the real estate implosion, a decade ago, that they were creating actual new innovative financial products to sell, these sort of artificial creations of real things into commodities to speculate, to run gambling, legalized global gambling games is essentially what they did. The only thing bigger than real estate now, because the wealth is more concentrated, is humans, is people, right? And in order to do that, they're going to essentially turn people into a financial commodity as human capital bonds. And this apparatus has been in place since the mid-1990s, setting it up, but it's tied in with public benefit systems. So it's tied in with access to education and healthcare and housing and food assistance and mental health and addiction treatment and all of these things that are tied into government systems. And so that's the actual product that this is hedge funds that are setting this up. I mean, it's Davos and it is the most powerful institutions of wealth in the world. If folks look up Impact Management Project, there are all the 2,000 top asset holders in the world, but it's the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's the Vatican Bank, it's the Mormons, it's Jack Ma, it's SoftBank, it's TIAA CREF, it's your pension fund, it's your insurance fund. It's everything has to channel it through our bodies because at this point, people don't have the liquidity to both acquire enough product to grow the economy at the rate at which capitalism demands. Everyone is in debt. And then their carrying capacity of the planet is somewhat reached, right? Like we're reaching the threshold of growth as we understand it. And so as we hit this threshold, the push is going to be to push us into a virtual space, to actually capitalism like breaks the wall and goes into a virtual environment. And we've seen that, like I saw that years ago in the classroom with behavioral management tools, where kids would have avatars and they would buy clothes with behavior points for their avatars. They've already been shifting to virtual consumption. You consume digital items. You identify your brand digitally. Not that there isn't any cost to that. Surely there's an energy cost to storing these things in a digital space and minerals and other things, but it's not the same. Right? You could have a closet full of 100 avatar clothes at a fraction of the cost of what that would be for real clothes.
Yeah, for sure. And you did mention education there, and you've had a lot to say about the direction that education is now being taken in under this sort of global poverty management kind of ethos. Talk to that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, so I would encourage folks there in the US, it's based in the United States, an organization called Knowledge Works. And they have a series of white papers that they actually just say everything that is planned. And it sounds outrageous until it actually happens. I would tell my husband, he's like, well, that would never happen. They would never give up schools. And I'm like, I don't know how they're going to do it, but they say that this is what they're going to do. So now here we are. But their vision, and this was connected with the MacArthur Foundation and Mozilla, is essentially to have lifelong learning. You're never done learning. Which in reality, all of us like learning. If we're curious minds, you agree that you learn things throughout your life. But this is like, you're never off the hook. You're always jumping through the next hoop to get the next credential to try to get the micro work, right? It's not pleasant learning. It's an obligatory check a box learning. And so their idea is that you will not have schools that have, here's an elementary school and a high school and a community college and a university and a graduate program. And no, you won't have any of that. You will just be, it's Pokemon Go education. You just continue to get these little skill points. It's like a virtual reality game in the real world. And that most bricks and mortar schools will go away and you will have drop-in centers. And at these drop-in centers, you'll have like your social worker who will chart your pathway. And as you acquire skills and badges, the AI is learning you and feeding you the next thing, right? And so essentially, all of this is aligned to planned regional economies. In the United States, it's called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It was set up by Obama. So there's regional planned economies by the US Chamber of Commerce. So this isn't communism and socialism. This is like run for IBM and the US Chamber of Commerce, because what they need kids to build the digital jail, to code the digital jail, but it's running you into this pre-existing career pathway. And they can essentially engineer their workforce through AI in advance and just brainwash kids through the digital platforms, and then gamble on it too, like create an impact market on the performance on the online system. So they're both engineering their labor market and they're creating impact opportunities for the social impact investors at the same time. It's really twisted.
Yeah, it is really twisted. How do you feel about the impact of, for example, like a kid who goes through that system, the impact on their socialization or their brain development versus doing things in a little bit more of an organic, natural kind of a way? I mean, I suspect you have some opinions on that side of it.
They don't want kids to know what real life is like. I mean, once you're in a digital space, particularly, I don't think virtual reality will be long-lived. Eventually, it will be primarily augmented reality. But right now, they're conditioning kids with virtual reality headsets. UNICEF is pushing a lot of this, actually. And they have an innovation fund that's actually their primary backer is Disney. And so they're in Africa pushing virtual reality training. And the company that's got these headsets, it's based in the UK, and on their website, they have headsets on preschoolers. So they have like a group of 6 preschoolers with these giant VR headsets, like sitting on the rug. It just makes you ill to see that, because what people aren't aware of is that when you're in a VR headset with these haptics, they're actually capturing biometric data off of them and behavioral data. It's not a one-way experience. It's not like you're experiencing out. They're actually experiencing you. And so these impact markets are actually built on measurable behavior change. So they are literally creating opportunities to digitally brainwash children with things on their faces.
Yeah.
Through government systems for profit. And emotional manipulation. I mean, and clearly we've done this. I mean, like we have MK Ultra, like the mind control. State governments have been investigating these systems for a very long time. I mean, not just the US, the USSR. Like there has been a lot of technology invested in digital mind control, but it's pretty graphic when you see that it's right there, right? And how do you protect kids? Because what I'm saying on the education system is, if the whole global economy is built on you competing your set of badges, your skill points that you have, even if you try to raise your kid outside the system, if you don't have a place for them to go that they can work with no badges, they're out of luck. And so we actually have to look at it holistically, that it's not simply the education system. We have to refuse globalization 4.0. And something that's relevant that's just happened, and I was engaging with folks yesterday on social media, was this Great Barrington Declaration, right? And it's this declaration that a number of key doctors, one from Stanford, one from Harvard, and one from Oxford, all signed saying like we should end the lockdowns. But there was nothing in there that spoke to the masking, that spoke to biometric digital identity, that spoke to contact tracing, that spoke to the biosecurity state. And what I'm trying to get people to understand is and those entities are actually all the ones who are setting up the impact bond markets, right? And everyone's like, but these are probably very nice people, and they're probably just really mean it and I'm like, sure, on the weekend, I'm sure they're very nice people, but they're actually representing the institutions that are implementing this identity system. So my fight isn't simply the COVID fight. I was in this fight before COVID. I'm not just against the lockdowns. It needs to be for the right reason. And if the medical community, the mainstream medical community, is going to run the biosecurity state for the impact investors, right? That the psychiatrists are going to be running the mental health treatment markets, right? And we're going to start making preschoolers wear Fitbits to, get their BMI down and all of these things. Like, we need to stop the blockchain identity systems, and we need to stop the biosecurity state, and to lift up the medical establishment, as even though millions of people have been marching and opposing this in big and small ways, opposing these lockdowns, that all of a sudden the Harvard and Stanford and Oxford doctors come on the scene and like, good, I'm so glad, like now we can move on. That actually is the wrong way to step off. And it's not about those individual people, it's about the system. We have to be very, very cautious about the medical establishment, because they are being set up to be the digital jailers in what's coming. So It's not just about the lockdown. As terrible as the lockdown is, it's going to be a system of lockdown, open. It's a mental control system that we're living in, and people need to understand where it is coming after.
Yeah, absolutely. My interest in the global pandemic is that it's like the most obvious and desperate, overt kind of attempt at installing this techno-fascist dictatorship that you're describing. So now is the time. Like we see more than ever, people are starting to wake up and go, oh, hang on a minute, something seems a bit off here. This doesn't make sense. What's going on? So I think it's a really good window or way in. It's a good in for getting people to see a bigger picture beyond things like lockdowns and fake pandemics and things like the rationale behind it, the economic structure that actually mandates the existence of a fake pandemic and the engineering of a fake pandemic, which is why I think your perspective is so brilliant and so valuable. I
just wanted to speak a little bit about the health management aspect. Sure. Because I think it's really important to understand the ways in which the narrative and the reality of what happened with the pandemic, at least in the US, that certain populations appear to have much higher negative impacts of this illness, right? Whether the nature of that was people being, incentives to put people on ventilators, which were definitely the bad choice, or, it's possible that there were other aspects in which certain racialized groups were targeted. But like with the Navajo Nation and with the Black community, especially in New York City, that they had very high levels of bad outcomes. And so it's important to understand in this larger framing, because what we're seeing now is a framing for a much longer range program. People need to understand it's a much longer range program. It's not just COVID. This is this new normal that they're trying to impose. The impact sectors, I had said, were education, healthcare, and housing. Essentially, they are going to weaponize social determinants of health. Okay, they're going to weaponize pre-existing health disparities in communities that are very real, right? I mean, there are very real disparities in our country in terms of access to healthcare, access to healthy food, access to stable housing. There are real issues of intergenerational trauma that are connected in these communities. But all of these things are actually now going to make those communities targets for impact investors. And those impact markets don't actually benefit from this problem being solved, right? No global market is going to eliminate the source of its profit. So that they will manage your trauma, they will manage your poverty, they will manage your food access, but they will never actually give you autonomy to get out of the situation, right? That's how this is going to work. And so we need to look at COVID and health management, because that's where Michael Bloomberg comes in. And I think too many people are focused on Bill Gates. He's convenient because essentially he covers over a lot of other individuals like Pierre Omidyar and Mark Benioff and Michael Bloomberg, who are the people that are going to be running the data dashboards, that are going to be managing people when they're in between pandemics, right? Like, because now we have to optimize our health always, because we never know when the next pandemic is going to come. So we really have to be like well-honed machines and always on top of things, because there's that thing out there that's going to come after us. And that's the framing that they want us to buy into.
Yeah.
And that is going to happen in this ubiquitous sensors are these smart cities. And the smart cities are inherently militarized cities. The internet is a military technology. It's birthed out of the military. And the smart city technologies come from New York City, and it's their partnership with Microsoft and Michael Bloomberg and the Federal Reserve. And so it is all a financialized police state, essentially, these smart environments. So they want you to put on your Fitbit, all right? They want to track you and make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to. In the impact markets, that's what the hedge funds are going to bet on. Did you meet your step goals today, right? Did you meditate? Did your head brainwave bands? Now we've mixed in these wearable technologies. And what's really chilling is that there's something called the DNA nudge band, that the Imperial College that set out the initial terrible report that was, proven to be so inaccurate, they have a whole R&D division. And one of their divisions actually developed something called the DNA nudge, which was a wearable wrist technology that you would scan your food. And it would supposedly, based on your DNA, tell you optimally what food you should buy. People are like, well, that's crazy. Who would ever do that, right? Well, it's crazy unless to get your food assistance, you have to scan your purchases that way, right? Or you're locked down and Amazon will only deliver the things that you're allowed to have. And then they track if you ate it. Maybe you have to have a sensor to show you recycled it properly. And again, I'm all about that people should have access to affordable, healthy food, right? And that you should have access to employment that lets you have a wage to buy that food and time off to cook it in an enjoyable way and eat it with your friends and like have all of those things. But you do not want to put nanotech and wearable technology and all of that and have Michael Bloomberg's police state looking over your shoulder, which is really what we're looking at, because the NHS actually arranged to buy 6.5 million of these nudge bands connected to the COVID testing.
Ah, interesting.
Right? Actually, there was a woman, I just added her into my database. I do a lot of mapping on little cis, and her name is Jessica Irvine. She writes for the Sydney Morning Herald. She's like an economist, journalist, whatever. And she wrote early on in this thing, and I needed to get it in, called Walk for the Dole. And so this was her op-ed. She said, well, I think we're all gaining a little weight while we're sitting at home. And we should, all those job seekers, they should actually have to walk around and prove that, they're getting out and maintaining their health. And look at Boris Johnson. Like after he had COVID, he just realized that obesity was a real problem, right? And so now their new health plan has all of these things around obesity, which again, it's putting it on the individual as opposed to the structure, right? Why is obesity a problem? There are many reasons, and many of them you cannot limit it to individual behavior, because it's individuals operating with environmental systems that are really antithetical to good health.
Yeah, totally.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, 100%. Okay, so the DNA nudge thing, that's the first I've heard of it, actually. So that's the whole point of it, isn't it, really? They always want to introduce this stuff as this fun novelty. Hey, try it out. Yay. Like how many steps are you going to take today and all this sort of stuff. But then the whole point of it is, of course, that there will come a time when you can't opt out of it, and you can't function unless you're hooked up to this system where you're constantly inputting your data into it. And if you become a dissident, or you don't want to wear it or whatever, then you're cut off from being able to purchase food, essentials, isn't it? Ultimately, it's not about being an optional health supporting thing. It's completely the opposite.
Yeah. Well, and I tell a story. I have a friend who was a teacher when we were doing education stuff, and she taught second grade in Maine. And her co-teacher had brought in this program to the school from UNICEF, and it was a Fitbit, and the kids were all supposed to like meet their fit goals or whatever. And if they did, UNICEF gave a food packet to a refugee child.
Wow. Yeah.
And then, this 7-year-old is coming up to the teacher going, if they have the food, why don't they just give it to the kids?
Exactly.
Right? I'm like, if they have the food, give it to them. Yeah. And these bands are actually like sold at Target, like retailers, and they're branded with Star Wars. So like it's the layer of Disney and marketing and retail culture and consumer culture and global aid systems. I came into this early on, like I say, I was like a recovering liberal, and then like now I'm a recovering leftist. Like I don't really belong in any of these spaces because I'm like, we need a better world. Like we need to look at this history, but we need to figure out something better.
Yeah.
But people should be able to eat and have safety and have care for children. And who in the world thought that they would get away with it? But I mean, they are. I guess that's the thing that I'm frustrated with, is they do seem to be getting away with it. So
and of course, it's only a small step there. I'm talking about performing a task to get a food package delivered to a poor, impoverished child. I mean, it's only one step removed from having to perform a task so that you get your food package.
Yeah, that's true.
It's trying to normalize this kind of thing, isn't it?
Could I say something about food?
Please.
Okay, so this is the thing that I've been working on mapping lately. Rockefeller Foundation, which clearly Rockefeller is backing a lot of this. They work closely with the Bloomberg Philanthropies. They've been doing contact tracing, and they're the foundational public health backers back to the 1910s with Johns Hopkins. And so Rockefeller is central. They're actually also the backers of the social impact markets. So the former head of the Rockefeller Foundation before the current one, her name was Judith Rodin, and she actually was the president of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So that's how it kind of comes back. That's when I first started looking into it. She created something called the Global Impact Investment Network. And now actually Rockefeller is funding something called, I really encourage people to look it up, the Commons Project. And the Commons Project, it kind of was like a sleeper cell last year, like last summer, and then it popped up in July, and they have a global board of 60 people. And if you actually look at who those 60 people are, like you realize, oh, this thing isn't going to just be over. Like they're not going to just go, oh, right. Okay, we'll put that in the drawer and move on. No, this is a long-term. And the products that they've developed, there's three pieces. One is health systems tracking. One is access to employment and education. And then one is mobility, like air travel and other sorts of travel. And what I keep trying to talk to people about, especially in immigration issues, is that we have to understand geofencing and real-time border changing. That really the idea of containing people in real time with smart systems, that your border, an illegal border could be your front door, like under quarantine. I'm trying to get people to sort of reimagine around certain longstanding race issues, that we need to rethink what immigration means in a globalized society under COVID or a pandemic. And biosecurity is that they can essentially contain you to your neighborhood, to 5 miles, to your door, to a country, like they can, and that's all done in real time through satellite. So the Commons Project, Rockefeller is backing that. I did want to mention the food. They have 2 reports recently out about food systems transformation. And a lot of it is being framed around sustainability and climate change. And again, we know through Agenda 21, the plan is that everyone is in these mega cities. So we depopulate the wildlands and we move everyone into these concentrated dense cities, and then we manage them. What's scary is I actually came across information early on, like the U.S. TRADOC, the Training and Military Command for the U.S. Army, has a whole division called the Mad Scientist Division. They actually have a YouTube channel, which is like interesting. Like and that's the stuff you can just watch on YouTube. But they have like a whole report from RAND called like Warfare in Urban Megacities. So they talk about having these megacities and then these belts for urban farming, essentially so that they can take them over for military maneuvers when they need to. You're like, how is all this going to happen? Well, I guess now that we see a little directed energy weapons, move people in the cities, get your farm belt out. So when the Rockefeller's talking about the food systems transformation, UN Sustainable Development Goal number 2 is hunger, right? So we're also seeing massive hunger. So you're seeing a lot of ads from UNICEF about child hunger, which again is very accurate. But what people are not realizing is that UNICEF is part of the problem. They're actually identifying social impact markets. This is all being done intentionally. And now instead of just war and famine, you can also use pandemic and global economic devastation to cause hunger. So that's the impact market is UN SDG 2. And I think 11 is smart cities or resilient cities, and Rockefeller is all about the resilient cities. So I've been looking into food management, like what are these systems? And in Technocracy, they want to know energy inputs and outputs. So they'd really like to know, like, how many calories did you eat? And then what did you do out of that? And there's this crazy thing that they've even got like toilets now with biometric sphincter identification, like down to that level, right? So like they can really do the input and output, but they need to control everything. So they actually, what they want is they want vertical farming so that they can have robot harvest, so that they can manage the nutrients. Everything is standardized, just like they're standardizing education. They can standardize all of the food systems and they can disconnect it actually from the earth.
Yep.
And the thing that I want to, and this is new to me, this sort of sacred aspect or the resonance, the energy systems, like the people who got me in March, they were holistic healers. Like these were not my people. Like I did not know much about this, but they were like, yeah, like we got you. And as they build the mechanistic energy systems, the 5G systems, these other man-made technological energy connections, they want to disconnect people and isolate people, both for the mining purpose and just to disempower people. So I know a lot of very healthy people are all about growing microgreens on their windowsill on a paper towel. It's not the same as food and soil. It's just not for long term. Like it could be a supplement, but it's not your food. And that's what Rockefeller wants to do. They want to have cargo containers with controlled water systems, with controlled lighting, and all of those are profit centers. And they'll probably push that in on global South communities and use structural adjustment, like make them take on debt to build warehouses, to build warehouse-based agricultural commodities and lab-grown meat and synthetic biology and CRISPR technology meats. And also they're talking about medicalizing food. So building into lettuce and tomatoes, vaccinations, right? So what if your nudge ban only lets you buy the vaccine tomato, right?
Yeah, right.
Your comorbidity, your health history of 3 generations back indicate that you can really only have this tomato, right? And it's not that far off. Like they have to make it socially acceptable. But that's where this is all going. The more I looked at it, and then it spun off into weaponized weather and, directed energy. Maybe they want to put all the food in a box because they really think that the whole world, like we've screwed up the whole atmosphere and we're never going to grow on natural soil again. But I don't want that. Like I want to fight that going down.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's astonishing. What I'm hearing there is, essentially the weaponization of food itself. And of course, they always sell it to us in a way that it's supposed to be beneficial to us. But really what it's doing is, it'll be the alteration of our DNA. It's like that, the micromanagement taken down to like the nano management. Right. Let's manage humans at the genetic level and we'll create them in our image. So we're creating simulations of humans out of real humans. And this whole system seems to be about creating simulations or simulacra of the real. So we're creating a parallel world of the unreal.
Right. And they can control it. And it's a military world. Like that's what I keep wanting to emphasize is that there's a book, Yasha Levine, it's called Surveillance Valley. It's a military history of the internet. So that piece is very important. The other thing that I think is interesting is the social engineering and eugenics element. So I was looking at this father of social entrepreneurship. His name is Michael Young. He died a number of years ago, but he was essentially the think tank leader of the Labor Party in the post-World War II era. But he was part of the Fabian Society. And when I got looking into that and the origins, and essentially Sydney and Beatrice Webb created the London School of Economics, which is incubating all these social impact bonds. And I'm like, it never occurred to me that the left had these layers of eugenics and classism and things built in, so that even within sort of, the NHS, people are like, oh no, it just went wrong. And I'm like, I don't know. Like if you actually look back, like where was these people's headspace? Was it we know better for those people who might need this stuff? Like we're the elite, we know that now that's in the hands of even more sociopathic people. And eventually it will be AI who decide to engineer it, how they want to engineer this.
Because why have humans involved in any of it at all? Allison, let's talk about the D9.
Okay. Well, so early on, I was looking at a webinar. The state of Rhode Island is sort of a test case for a lot of things. So it was a test bed for ed tech and personalized learning because it's such a small state. It's like this little crucible. And the governor there, Gina Raimondo, she's a neoliberal Democrat, and her husband was the head of McKinsey, their global education unit. So, and she came out of sort of social impact tech. So this webinar was essentially about Israel coming in to run Rhode Island's COVID reopen program. And it wasn't just about COVID, it was essentially creating blockchain government for the state of Rhode Island beyond COVID. And there was a lot of dialogue about Israel being a digital nation and using this technology. Also Estonia, when you hear about blockchain, Estonia is, again, a small nation, an incubator, sort of a playground for these digital technological systems. Because what the impact investors really want is they want all of your data in one big lake that they can access. So they know if they gave you good food, if you needed diabetic shoes, right? Or they want to know if they gave you pre-K, did you end up as a juvenile delinquent? So they need all of the data in one place. And that's what the digital identity system is going to do, and blockchain, and also connected to the sensors. So when I was listening to this, again, no one else here is talking about why is Israel running a state COVID reopen program in the first place, but digging into these digital nations. And even like within Israel, they were talking about having apps that would tell you your rights. Like it was like your rights app. And I'm thinking, why would you need an app to tell you? Like everybody gets their own different personal set of rights, I guess, depending on it really is sort of a social credit scoring sort of system. But I got to digging into this a little bit more, and I don't remember all 9, but a lot of this is sort of a colonialist enterprise, but like Canada, the UK, and Australia and Israel, Uruguay and Portugal. And there are these nations that are the bleeding edge of essentially GovTech, CivTech, getting everything in this sort of interconnected, optimized situation. And early on, when I was looking at Australia, there's the disability payment system. They have it on blockchain. There's a paper called Making Money Smart, and it was digitally programmed. And you think about globalization 4.0 and disability, they're actually reworking and revisiting many disabled people to see maybe you can work, right? Maybe you could run a cafe robot from your house, even if you are chronically ill. Maybe you could work through a robot in some other foreign country, right? And so they're actually, these revisiting programs around disability are part of that. But Australia is very leading edge on the digital nation. And a lot of the work that I did early on, there are many connections between Singapore and Australia. And Jane Halton was at Event 201, and the person who was behind the Singapore monetary unit was also at Event 201. So there's a lot of modeling between the COVID infrastructure between Singapore and Australia, but also Singapore is sort of the incubator of smart city systems engineering. And so I think it's worthwhile for people in Australia who are examining these larger systems to look at what that means for COVID in your country, because literally the biosecurity state is going to run on blockchain. And initially, before this all happened, my understanding was, they're going to get blockchain identity by offering free college, and it's going to be your blockchain transcript. Your education transcript would be on blockchain. That's how I was coming into it. That's what all of the indicators I saw, that, they're going to give people free 2-year college, and it's going to come with the condition that you have a blockchain ID. And that's been piloted in many countries already. You should look and see if it's in Australia. I'm not sure. But then this hit. And I'm like, no, this is better, because they can make you get it for national security reasons. So they're going to give people a blockchain identity system for health, but then layer in the education and the housing and all of your government services, right? And then eventually you can just have your rights on an app, right? And they can change in real time depending on how you interact with the police state. And you had mentioned, I think, about the police, the defund the police part. Yeah. And I will add, I wrote a piece. Actually, I was in jail for 20 hours, like about a year ago, as part of a protest around our housing. Our housing situation is all part of this as well. And I tried to intervene with someone who was being choked by someone who was an out of uniform officer. But I got to see how these systems worked. And what I realized is, from navigating what they would say is a diversion program. They want to say, you just have misdemeanors, we'll put you in this diversion program. Well, what was the diversion program? Well, these diversion programs are essentially like just the way these folks don't want to build schools and manage schools. They can't build enough prisons to hold all the people that will be displaced by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And they don't want to pay that many guards. So what they are doing is they are turning the world into a jail. I believe that Gaza is the model of the open air prison.
Yep.
And that instead of police, they will continue to criminalize poverty, but they're not going to put you necessarily physically in jail. They will put you under state control in other ways.
Sure.
And it will be, here's your code, here's your work assignment, here's your mental health assignment, and it's a pathway. And so essentially the social workers become the guards.
Yep.
And the educators, the social workers, the drug counselors, all of these people are the agents of the state, but is a new form of state control. which again is not to say there's very brutal things happening under the lockdown circumstances and things that are very aggressive in terms of globalization and globalized police forces. That isn't my strength. But the social credit scoring and the management of large sections of the population being under state control in that way, I think is very real and something that people need to understand.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned Gaza. I remember Chris Hedges wrote an article some years back called "The Elite Will Make Gazans Out of Us All." Yeah. And, that wouldn't have made sense to a lot of people, but it turns out that he's absolutely right. That probably is the model, except the level of technological imposition in there is just going to be off the charts. It's going to be exponential.
Even pre-Gaza, because a lot of those systems were built actually on the way we treated indigenous people in the United States, right? The reservation systems and these boarding school systems. And so I would say in terms of the criminalized poverty, they really are after the children, and children in poor families, in Black and brown families, indigenous families are going to be targets because they're the impact opportunities. And if you can criminalize poverty and remove children from homes, it very much concerns me that the residential school apparatus will resurface. And I know the Vatican Bank is a big player in all of this, right? So these systems of power and abuse, I think we need to be really, really mindful about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, man, I wish we could spend some more time digging into that because it's so important. Take us home, bring it home. What's your takeaway message, and where can people, learn more about your work and all that jazz?
Well, I would just say, I think that we are it feels like a battle of forces. This is this culmination of a larger battle of the sacred and profane and humans versus mechanism. And I don't want people to walk away feeling totally depressed because there are people who get it. And I think we're actually very powerful. I think they wouldn't want to control us if we didn't have incredible power. We just have to sort of awaken to what that is and connect. And I always say I connected with someone who taught me about blessings on the water. And so I'm like, many of us are connected to bodies of water. And I think if you're feeling down, go outside, go for a walk, see if you can find some water. We're connected that way. So yeah, you're not alone and this isn't hopeless. And you can find more information from me on wrenchinthegears.com, or I also have a YouTube channel. If you just look up Allison McDowell YouTube, it should come up. I have a lot of talks there.
Beautiful. Yeah, I know Allison could talk for hours on this, and unfortunately we have to cut it short, but I can't thank you enough for the work that you've been doing and the awareness raising you've been doing, Allison. It's been phenomenal. So folks, it is wrenchinthegears.com, Allison's blog. And I think I'll have to get you back for another episode sometime, Allison. But in the meantime, thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting with you again in future.
That was great. Thank you.